It's 20 minutes.
Good afternoon, highly esteemed elders, my teachers, senior colleagues, and colleagues. It's a privilege to be standing on this podium to give this talk. And I want to stand on the protocol that Professor Kare had laid. I believe I'm giving this talk because I'm part of the faculty's research grant committee. Now I'm going to be talking on research grant management, and I'm going to be using this outline. Next slide, please. Next slide. We'll look at the introduction. Go back one slide. Introduction, we'll look at the scope of research grant management. We'll look at a few steps to successful grant management, and then we'll summarize. Next slide. Now, by way of introduction, what is a grant? Grants are monies that are provided for specific purposes. Grant is not a loan, so you're not expected to pay back. Neither is it a gift, which means you cannot spend it the way you will. It's a contract, and the contract must be adhered to. Next slide. Now, grants can be sourced either from government, like we know of TET Fund, or it can be sourced from corporations, whether public or private corporations. Next slide. And there are different types of grants, but my bit this afternoon will be to focus on research grants. Next slide. Next slide. Now, what is research grant? A research grant is monies made available for funding a scientific research. We'll look at the scope of research grants. Now, every grant, next slide. Every grant, yes, go back to the grant cycle. Every grant has a life cycle that starts from when there is a call or you solicit for the grant, goes through the evaluation process, the grant is awarded, and then you begin to implement the grant, and then there is a closeout. Now, Professor Kare, next slide, had talked to us on grant writing. A lot of the hard work go into the pre-award stage of the grant itself. So all of that hard work goes in there. And then after the hard work, your hard work is rewarded by you getting the monies to fund the research. You now enter into the post-award phase. And of course, a lot of things need to go into that post-award phase, including understanding clearly the contract that you're entering into, setting up systems to make sure that you follow the guideline exactly the way it should be, managing weaknesses. Professor Kare talked about conflicts. All of that will come in during the post-award phase. And finally, you want to close out the grants. In other words, you want to feedback the funders as to the reports and the deliverables that are expected of you. Next slide. So in summary, we can say the scope of a research grant is not just the implementation phase, but it begins from when you start to conceive the idea, right from the grants writing. You need to manage that process very well, because if you have a faulty budget, then it's going to affect everything at the end of the day. You run into troubled waters, along the line. Next slide. We are here. The research grant has been awarded. So much euphoria. The question is, what next? What should I do? Next slide. Now, a couple of things you should do. The first thing I put there is that you must ensure that you complete the paperwork. There's a lot of, it's a legal contract. There's a lot of documentation, a lot of things to be signed. You need to complete that. You also need to get ethics clearance if you hadn't gotten that before the research. It is so important to set up a finance mechanism. Don't assume that it is money, you know how to spend it. There are so many things that go into the award, the direct costs, the indirect costs. You must know how and set up a mechanism of managing the finances. Of course, you must develop implementation plans, systems, and structures. And it's so important that you do not keep the award to yourself. You must let your institution know about the award. You must sensitize your institutional personnel. Next slide. So we'll just talk briefly. I will take us through 7 steps to successful grant management. Next slide. The first step is that you must show gratitude. Yes, it is not a loan, it is not a gift, but it's something that is going to advance your career. It's something that is going to help build capacity, not just for you, but also for your institution. So just a simple gesture of sending a thank you note, a thank you letter, sets a big stage for goodwill for your project. Now, the thank you letter should be timely, and it's advisable to state clearly how much grant you have gotten in the award, how much the grant is worth in your letter. Next slide. You must notify your institution of the award. Some grants come directly to the institution, like TETS Fund. TETS Fund would, tell your institution directly. Some other grants will not tell your institution. Perhaps it's coming from a corporation. The onus is on you to let your institution know about the grants. And not just to let them know, let them also help to create awareness. So you want the grants to be published in your institutional bulletin, in your institutional newsletter, creating awareness. Now, the benefit is not just for you as a researcher. Your work is now gaining more awareness. There's also benefits for the funders. They are also getting a good feedback as to CSR, quote and unquote. Next slide. Now, the third step is that you need to execute the agreement. I have underlined the agreement there for emphasis. It is not what you think, it is not what you will, it is not what you want to do. It is an agreement, and you must adhere to the agreement. The agreement, for example, has a definite timeline. So if the agreement says the study should be done within 10 months, then it means that study should start and finish within 10 months. If the study says five years, you should work with the timeline in mind and have the deliverables in mind. It's also important that you look at the agreement, because nothing is cast in stone. For example, we find ourselves in this COVID era, inflation and a lot of things have come. And maybe you had written a budget some 2-3 years ago. Prices of things have changed. There is need, to get more funding. Does the agreement state that you can approach other donors or not? That must be clear. And from the agreement, usually they would state the procedures for amendment. So if you need to make any changes, for example, God forbid, one of the investigators passes on, what happens? There are laid down rules written down in the agreement that you have to follow. And for each agreement, as a researcher, you have your responsibilities, and your institution also has its responsibilities towards ensuring that the grant is properly managed. It is so important to keep all forms of communication. You have to change anything in the policy, in the agreement. You must document the communication on that for auditing purposes. Next slide. Now, as you go along in the research, it's important to monitor or track activities. How do you monitor the activities? You can break it down into compartments. You want to engage project staff. You cannot do it all. You cannot see to the day-to-day running of the research and do other parts of the research. So there are people who are there to help you out. You must monitor those people. You must track every financial spending. Every expenses, any money spent must be receipted for. If it's an indirect cost and you do not have receipt, then the certificate of honorarium must be made available. Ethics clearance is usually not a one-time for all thing, particularly if the study or the research is going to span the period of the approval. So if your institution would usually give ethics approval for 1 year and your study is going to span for 2 years, it is your responsibility to make sure that you get a renewal of that approval, or for whatever reason you needed to amend the protocol. It is also your responsibility to get a renewed or an updated ethics approval. We cannot overemphasize the need for meetings when it comes to monitoring and tracking. You must meet regularly with your team, and everybody on the team, like Professor Karaye said before, must know their roles and their responsibilities. And you all meet at the center to discuss the gains and the challenges that you're having along the way. And finally, you must document every activity through various methods. So you have, for example, you have your ethics clearance. You have the hard copy, yes, you have kept the hard copy. But wisdom says, make a soft copy of that ethics clearance and keep it safe in maybe a passworded computer, for example, or somewhere in the cloud. Next slide. Team effort. You cannot do it alone. Right from when you are writing the proposal, that is when you begin to form the team, not just at the point where you already have the award. So everybody is carried along. And if you work together as a team, you can better deliver on your timelines. You can better deliver on what the research is all about. Again, if you work as a team, as one, problems are easily identified and they are tackled early enough. Next slide. Next slide. Now, an important part of the team that you must work with is the finance team, the finance personnel. As doctors, many of us, well, I don't know whether I'm correct to say many of us, but some of us are not really financially literate. We know how to spend money, but we don't know how to read in between the lines. Remember that the agreement is a legal document, and there are some undertones that you may not be able to interpret correctly. If you involve a finance person, they will help you to understand the award better and help you to implement the award better. For example, as simple as how to handle cost of travel, which is an indirect cost. It can mess you up if you do not do it correctly. Next slide. The sixth step to successfully managing a research grant will be communication. Communication, communication, communication. Now, who are you communicating with? You must talk to the funders. What are you talking to them about? Anything that is not clear. Like I like to say, Mr. Assumption has died. Don't assume you understand what they are talking about. Make a phone call, write an email, talk to the funders. Even when there are no issues, keep the communication line open. You must also talk within your team. Of course, if you're going to have an effective team, then that team must be a team that is communicating amongst themselves. Now, it's so important that if you're communicating within the team or with the funders, and you have to make a change, and that change borders on changing something in the agreement, that communication must not be verbal alone. That communication must be written. So instead of a phone call, the man says, okay, you can go ahead. No, insist on getting an email, insist on getting a text message, even a WhatsApp message that you can show later on that this was, you can make reference to when the chips are down. Next slide. And the final step is that you must disseminate your research finding. It is unethical to conduct a research and not disseminate it, more so if that research is funded. Now, there are certain areas you need to prioritize. It's not enough also to document your findings on just any journal. It has to be a peer-reviewed journal. That is advisable. You can also disseminate findings in scientific meetings. And more importantly, is that we must begin to break through to get to the policymakers. We do great researches. We write them up in our peer-reviewed journals. The policy makers, the decision makers never read our journals, so it doesn't impact on what we are doing. It doesn't impact on the community at large that we are serving. So we must be able to break through to get to the people who would use the findings from our research to begin to improve the lives of our people. Next slide. Now, from what I've said, research grants therefore means that we must be responsible, we must be accountable, we must consult widely, and we must be informed. Next slide. Now, this brings me to grants administration services. Next slide. Now, services of grant administration would include, but not limited to, identification of funding opportunities, budget development, proposal submission, responses to donor due diligence checks, and compliance management. Next slide. In other words, we can summarize a grant administration office that is well set up as a one-stop shop for the effective and successful management of a research award. Next slide. And then I asked myself, like Professor Karaye has been asking himself as well, where are we in West African College of Physicians? We are a training institution. We are a research institution. Next slide. And that took me to the website of the college. And I found this organogram on the website. And I began to ask myself, where exactly is the grant administration officer? It's there on the organogram, but it's just floating. It's even very far away from the accounts officer, who is supposed to help to, offer some advice as per managing monies. I think that this office should be given more attention. I think that our residents, our trainees, will benefit a lot from the services that this office can offer. The office can start out not even awarding grants, but helping us to look for funding opportunities and pulling it together. Just sending WhatsApp messages will give researchers ideas as to where to go look for funds. You can call them up for advice. You have your budgets, written out. They can offer advice as to how to package the budget so that it can help, in ensuring you win the grant eventually. And when the award comes, they can also, there are so many useful things that this office can do. So I'm adding my voice to that of Professor Karaye to say that West African College of Physicians should look more closely to developing a grants administration office. Next slide. So in summary, we have looked at research grant management, and we have seen that it is something that starts right from when you begin to conceive the idea that you want to write for a grant award, through to when you get the award, and then, of course, the closeout process. And there are certain things that you cannot undermine. You cannot undermine team effort. You cannot undermine you being organized and realistic in what you want to do. You must, by all means, treat the grant as a contract, and you must keep communicating and communicating. Thank you very much.